To answer the question in the title, no, probably not. In fact, they might not even be footprints at all. But, hear me out, they might be something just as incredible. And if they are, what a story that would be. This story. Did you know that the Mediterranean once dried up? It sounds crazy, but it's true. Virtually the entire basin, both east and west, would have had 1.5 kilometers less water than it has today. They call that the Messinian salinity crisis, and it would have happened from around 6 million to 5.3 million years ago. As you can see from this picture, that meant a dramatically different European landscape. It still had a few large but extremely salty bits of water remaining, kind of like massive dead seas, but for the rest, just land. Most importantly for this story, traversable land. So for several 100,000 years, animals would have been able to casually walk across what we now consider the Mediterranean. Prehistoric variations of elephants and hyenas and tigers and hippos, animals that we generally now associate with Africa that are long extinct in Europe. But most importantly to this story, we're also starting to begin to question if maybe one of those animals might have been an ape, or as science calls them, a hominid. And because of 2 teeth found in Greece and Bulgaria, as well as these footprints here in Crete, we're starting to question if they might have even been hominins, which are pretty similar words, so perhaps I should explain that. Hominids are the great apes. Put another way, they are not our ancestors, whereas hominins, on the other hand, are. Or at the very least, they could be. Hominid, gorilla, hominin, you. Okay, back to the teeth. Those 2 molars from southern Europe, one of which was supposedly found by a Nazi in a World War II bunker, date between 7.3 and 7.1 million years ago, which, for those keeping count, is around 1 million years before the Mediterranean started to dry. But it's also at the end of the era of the European apes, called the Valesian crisis, roughly 9 million years ago, when European forests contracted and the ecosystem that allowed for those great apes collapsed. Before we found these teeth, we had presumed that by 7 million years ago, all of those apes had gone extinct. But that's clearly not the case. All the apes can't really have died if 2 million years later, apes are still dropping teeth. They call the creature that once grew this history-shattering molar the Grecopithecus, now considered Europe's last ape. But it might even go further than that. Because in 2017, a German researcher would claim that due to the type of enamel on the tooth, Grecopithecus might not just be a hominin, but could also even be the missing link. An ancestor to humans a full 1 million years older than the oldest that we've ever found. The thing we've been searching for since we began our journey towards understanding human evolution. And what's more, it might even change the true dawn of humanity from Africa to Europe. At least it was certainly presented that way in the news. Every single other researcher who studied this, however, would disagree with that hypothesis. They'd say that there was not nearly enough evidence to make any of those claims. They'd say that the molar showed just as many signs as being from a hominid as it does from a hominin. Which kind of tracks, honestly, since all the other ancestral hominin species come from Central Africa. It just seems wildly illogical to suggest that this was the creature that started everything based off of a single tooth. Put simply, if it is the missing link, it sure is a long way from every other link. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just makes it extremely unlikely. Which brings me back to the start of this story, here on the island of Crete, where researchers who are keen to prove that European origin hypothesis said that they found some footprints in the rock. Those footprints. Footprints that, according to the people who found them, are at least 7.1 million years old, just like that Grecopithecus. And in these prints, those initial researchers claimed to have found evidence of a strong big toe and a small pinky, a ball, an arch, and no claws on the foot, all of which are very good indicators of a bipedal creature. Footprints like these would have almost certainly come from a hominin and not an ape. So surely this must have been Grecopithecus, right? And this is the missing link, no? Well, no. Because after they published that research, more people came here and they found that pretty much everything they said about it was wrong. Actually, now that I say that, the first guy to come here was a Greek school teacher who carved out and stole 8 of the footprints, presumably to sell them. Bit of a dick move, if you ask me, but he did go to prison for it, so there's that. But eventually, he'd be followed by much more objective researchers, and what they determined was that in all likelihood, if these were footprints at all, rather than just coincidentally looked like them, which I should note they were not able to determine, they would have been placed here no more than 3 million years ago, not 7.1. Which places this over 4 million years after that Grecopithecus lost that tooth, 2 million years after the Mediterranean returned. And since no mammals on this planet have ever survived that length of time unchanged, it would be fairly safe to say that even if these were footprints, they certainly didn't come from him. On top of that, they might not even be footprints. It could all just be a coincidence. Those secondary researchers also showed that the place this creature would have supposedly been walking 3 million years ago would have been covered by ankle-deep water. A place where, even if they could be recorded, any footprints would have been washed away by the waves. And so, unless they just so happened to have been wandering here at the exact right time during an ice age, those researchers saw very little reason to believe that this would have been made by a mammal at all. Or, at the very least, certainly not proof of a missing link. Which, as you might imagine, did not make the news. But, huge but, Brazilian-sized but, if these are footprints, which they still could be, what would that mean? Well, let's look at it as open-minded as possible. Because in my opinion, at least, nothing here has truly been settled. And well, obviously I'm no expert. Reading all this research, I can't help but feel that even the second researchers made a few errors in their judgment. I just don't think they got it entirely right. And please note that I'm not actually disagreeing with them on their science. I'd presume that part's pristine, just their logic. Because in their closing statements, the reasons that they list for why they don't believe this could be a hominin don't entirely make sense. More specifically, when they say that due to there being 100 kilometers of open ocean between Crete and the Greek mainland 3 million years ago, for any hominin to have been here meant that they would have had to sail. And since they almost certainly didn't have sailing, this means, of course, they couldn't have been here. And this is where I find a problem in their argument, because they absolutely could have been here. Those researchers were wrong. They wouldn't have to sail. I'm not saying it's likely. I'm not saying it happened. Just that it's possible. And what's more, they could, in some way, be connected to a missing link. Again, it is extremely improbable, but it's not impossible. And my argument for that is twofold. One, we know that Greece had an ape, possibly a hominin, 7.1 million years ago. It survived 2 million years past the Great Milesian Crisis, and therefore would have in all likelihood been adapted to a different environment than the many apes who didn't. And based solely on the 2 teeth that we've found, it seems that at least some of those Grecopithecus lived near the coast. Perhaps that was their environment. So who's to say that as the sea dried up, they didn't follow that same coast as it moved? It would have taken hundreds of thousands of years to dry, so who's to say that the descendants of that creature, if they did exist, didn't just walk to Crete? Slowly, over generations, following the coasts until they connected. With hundreds of thousands of years to do it in, whatever creature came out of that Grecopithecus, if one came at all, could well have had reason to walk to Crete. No sailing required. And more than that, there's no real reason to presume that they couldn't have walked all the way back to Africa. The Grecopithecus still might well be that missing link. Nothing in that regard has changed. It's just not likely. But if they did walk to Crete, when the greatest flood in Earth's history happened, and the entire Mediterranean filled back up over the course of a few weeks, whatever was living in the mountains of Crete would have been stuck here forever. Everything below them would have been washed away in that flood. And if an ape had walked here, they might well have adapted to living here. If they lived here, it's not impossible that their descendants could have walked this shore millions of years later. If these are footprints, they might not themselves represent a missing link, but it remains in the realm of possibility that they are an offshoot of one. It's just extremely unlikely. And keep in mind, I'm speaking here out of pure conjecture, but Up until a few years ago, we had no proof that Homo erectus had made it to Crete either. Until we found those teeth, we didn't know about the Grecopithecus, and we thought that all of Europe's apes had already gone extinct. So really, all it takes to prove this is to find a single bone. A bone we haven't found yet, granted, but that is a far cry from impossible. The second argument that I have against them having to sail here is actually quite simple, really. It's that other creatures got here, so why couldn't they? After the Mediterranean refilled, the Isle of Crete still saw the arrival of animals who I feel are just as unlikely to make that journey as a hominin would be. This island would see the arrival of two different types of elephants, which granted have a pretty good trunk snorkel, so I can envision that one. It would see hippos and otters, which swim, so I can see that one too. But it would also see deer and mice and rats and a shrew, creatures that absolutely could not have made that swim, at least no better than any ape could. The deer certainly didn't know how to sail, and it got here, so why not a hominin? But I get it, 100 kilometers is a long way. It's hard to imagine anything going that far, even an elephant. But if you think about a group of pre-humans, let's say clinging to a tree, they can survive for what? Given the exposure, lack of water, temperature of the Eastern Mediterranean, 3, maybe 4 days? Just gauging based on the experience of modern humans, who obviously have a different physiology. But just for argument's sake, let's say it's 4 days. If you're talking about 100 kilometers, just riding the currents, that's around 1 kilometer an hour. And the average current in the Mediterranean is around 1 kilometer an hour. If you enter the water off of the Greek mainland, the current would very likely bring you directly to Crete. I'm not saying it would have been easy. I'm certainly not saying that it happened. I'm just saying it's possible. And you can further prove that just by looking at South America. The continent of South America has monkeys. Monkeys that came from Africa, not as Pangaea. They didn't walk there. Far more recently. There is no other clear explanation in science to how the monkeys got there except across the Atlantic. And if those monkeys can cross an ocean, I think it's safe to say that a Greek ape wouldn't have had to sail to get to Crete. But that said, even with all the conjecture I've already laid down so far, I want to take that one giant step further. We know that Homo erectus had rafts at minimum 130,000 years ago, and we know that because they made it here to Crete. We know that the Neanderthal had rafts at minimum 430,000 years ago because they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, which, granted, is 13 kilometers and 2.5 million years after the time frame I'm talking about. But again, I'm just talking about possibility. This isn't about factual reality. But in the realm of possibility, is it really that much of a stretch to think that earlier hominins might have figured out that if one tree floats, two together float better? Again, not that I believe it happened. This is long before the advent of tools. I'm just saying I wouldn't discount it as impossible. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for, and every day we seem to find more evidence that our hominin ancestors were incredibly clever beings. So, while I don't disagree on the science, I do kind of disagree. I suppose I'll summarize by saying that just because they were laid here 3 million years ago doesn't mean these couldn't have come from a hominin. Nobody would have had to sail for that to be true. They'd just have to find a way to survive for millions of years longer than we currently know they did. To be clear, I am not a scientist. All I did to make this episode was read what those actual scientists wrote and then thought about it for a while. But what I am certain of, scientist or not, is that if there were teeth in Greece, there could have been some feet in Crete. That's it. Missing link or not. So to end this story, I just want to say that I hope Greece keeps its school teachers in prison. Because until we know exactly what these prints are, until I leave this island anyway, I'm going to be on a keen lookout for teeth. This is Rare Earth. Do you feel you can take 100 kilometers of open ocean?